Maybe that's because I've spent a lot of my career not being very specialized, even though it may sound very specialized to talk about something like phosphorus, but I have worked in a lot of different dimensions of it. I published a paper on pandas, giant pandas once. We've worked on cancer biology. We've worked on all kinds of things because maybe I have a short attention span.
This is A New Angle, and I'm your host, Justin Angle, marketing professor at the University of Montana. This podcast is my chance to speak with cool people doing awesome things in and around the great state of Montana. We are proudly underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot. Hey folks, welcome back and thanks for tuning in. Get ready to learn some big words. Today I speak with Jim Elser, Bierman Professor of Ecology at the University of Montana and Director of the Flathead Lake Biological Station. Jim studies limnology and is a world-class scholar, as evidenced by his recent election to the National Academy of Sciences. In this conversation, Jim teaches me all about his field of study, why it's important, and why Montana is the best place on earth for his research. I learned a ton from Jim, and I hope that you do too. So let's get into it right now. Okay, so we're here today with Jim Elser. Jim, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
You know, this is it's taken a little bit of work to pull this one together. You're up at the Flathead Biological Center, which we'll talk about in a moment. You were down on campus. We had the date wrong, and then you tried to get down here again today, and we're in an endless traffic jam. So we're doing this remotely, and I appreciate your flexibility today.
Well, it's anything worth doing is worth spending a little time on.
Well, you don't know that it's worth doing yet, you know. So
all right, we'll see about that, I guess.
Yeah, hopefully we'll. That's an empirical question, right?
Okay, that's right.
Anyway, so you are the director of the Flathead Biostation. Tell us about what is the biostation? What happens up there?
Well, the Flathead Lake Biological Station is a part of the University of Montana, but it serves a broader community than only the university. It is, I like to think of it as like a super collider for ecology.
Ooh.
So super colliders are apparatus that, society invests in to make physics discoveries, and field stations are investments that society makes to make discoveries about the environment around us. So this biostation, the Flathead Lake Biological Station, has been here since 1899. It's one of the oldest field stations of its kind in the United States. Almost as old as the university itself. It was founded by one of the university's first professors, this guy by the name of Morton Elrod. He has a building named after him on campus. And, pretty much when he started at the university in the mid-1800s there, he just started coming up this direction and started bringing students and colleagues and others with him to document the natural history of the area. And over time, he continued to do that. And over time, more sort of infrastructure started to appear. And eventually, a pretty big operation was put in place. And now we have 35 year-round employees here at the station. During summer, we have 85 people on payroll. We have 6 or 7 pretty substantial buildings for research and for housing and for administration. We can accommodate about up to 100 people here at a time. We have a lot of students who come through in the summer for taking our summer session. They come from all over the world, actually, and we conduct a lot of pretty cool advanced research funded by NASA and the National Science Foundation and other organizations. And then the other thing we do is we maintain a rigorous monitoring program on the lake and the rivers that flow into it to sort of assure the water quality and the health of the ecosystem on behalf of everyone who loves this lake. So that's kind of what we do, maybe in a nutshell, maybe not.
Yeah, it's interesting that, I think most folks, that folks know I'm a professor, and the first question they ask is, what do you teach? And teaching is a big part of our jobs in general. You're more of a research professor. You have students in the summer, and you probably advise a lot of graduate students, I would presume. But talk a little bit about your life as an academic and what that's all about.
Yeah, so as the director, I'm in a more administrative role. So I, work with our staff here to make sure the station is running smoothly. We have buildings to keep up. We have, streets to plow. We operate a wastewater treatment plant. We do all kinds of things in addition to the research that we do. So my profile is a little different than a typical faculty member, or at least my profile before I took this job. I do teach in the summer. I teach a field ecology class with Diana Six from down there on campus.
Okay.
We do have 3 other faculty members here who are more in the regular faculty profile. They have, the regular distribution of duties, which includes a teaching assignment here on the station in summer during our summer session. And then also they teach on campus during the academic season. And so they mix their teaching and their research and their service in the way that professors generally do.
And I can't remember, Jim, when you came on board. It was like 5 years ago or so.
We just finished our 4th summer, so
Okay.
we're coming into our 5th year. Yeah. So they continue to introduce me as the new guy around, but I don't feel that new anymore. People, I think, hopefully getting used to me. Maybe they'll get tired of me soon. I don't know, but
I doubt that.
It's feeling more comfortable now. I feel more at home.
And so you are. You're going to have to coach me through some of the vocabulary here. Generally, I use the fact that the sign that I can't pronounce many of the words that I need to pronounce to have an interview is the sign that I'm talking to somebody really smart. So that'll be the case today. But my understanding is you study limnology, right?
Yeah.
And I don't even know it. Well, I think I have an idea about what that is. But tell us what it is and tell us how you got interested in it.
To put it shortly, limnology is oceanography, but in lakes.
Okay, I like that.
So most people know what oceanography is, study oceans. Well, limnology is sort of the same thing, but studying lakes, not just lakes, but also ponds, also rivers and streams. It's sort of the study of inland waters. And, just like oceanography is, pretty interdisciplinary, combines physical properties of the oceans and their chemical properties and their biological properties. Same thing with limnology. We study the physical, chemical, and biological things that are going on in lakes and rivers. And I'm mostly a biologist, but when you're a limnologist, you find yourself having to learn all those other parts, like the chemical parts and the physical parts, even though you might not specialize in them.
Yeah, tell us about how you got interested in this.
Well, I was sort of a undergraduate with vague ideas of what I wanted to do with my life. I knew what I didn't. Yeah, I didn't want to become a doctor because my father was a doctor, and I would faint whenever I'd go on rounds with him and pass out in the hospital. I was very queasy. Remained that way, actually. Anyway, so medical school is not going to be for me. I had an idea that I was going to do something in nature. I like being outside and such. Maybe a forest ranger, park ranger, something like that. But then, here's the power of a field station. I went to the field station that was associated with my undergraduate university, which is the University of Notre Dame. And they had a field station in northern Wisconsin. And I took a 4-week class up there, and it was super fun and super cool. And I discovered that there was a whole, set of organisms that lived in lakes that I didn't know about before, and that there were people who spent their whole lives studying them, and that there was a whole discipline of science called limnology that existed that I didn't know about before, and that's sort of what started it for me as sort of a junior in college.
Sure. And did you go straight to graduate school, I would presume?
Yeah, I went straight to graduate school, did a master's degree, then I worked for a few years on a limnology project as a technical scientist, technician, and then I did my PhD, and then I started my faculty career.
Yeah. And so why Montana? Why was the Flathead Station on your radar? And why would you choose to move your work here?
Well, the Flathead Station is well known in the field of limnology and aquatic ecology, nationally, internationally. A lot of great work been done up here over the years. Great programs, well known to have great facilities. Previous director, Jack Stanford, did a great job. So it was well known in the field. And I have a attraction to field stations. A lot of my research in the past has been done out of different field stations around the world. So I like working at them, and the whole concept of them. Obviously, I got started at one.
Sure. Does that has to do with just the access, like you're in it?
Yeah, you're in it. You're there. It's all happening around you. Right. There's some things you can't observe or can't track or keep your finger on unless you're right there. If you have to, drive even several hours away to somewhere else to get your data, it's going to really change the sorts of studies you can do.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a faculty member at Arizona State University for 26 years, which is kind of a tough place to be a limnologist.
Yeah, not really. A ton of water around there.
Yeah, so I did a lot of traveling. It was great. I mean, the university was good to me, and I had a good time there. But I had traveled the world to different projects, doing them in different places, and that was fun and everything. But it's also kind of stressful and hard to keep going.
And had you been doing any? I know you do some work up in Glacier. Had you been doing any of that work in Montana before coming to the biostation?
No, I had never been to Montana actually before I interviewed for the job. So yeah, I mean, I've been living in Arizona for a long time. Lived in California, worked in Colorado on some field projects. Traveled around a bit, but had never had a chance to come to Montana. So pretty cool to have this chance.
Yeah, I mean, it must be just sort of the pure immersive situation that you're in, but also, I mean, we're kind of at the forefront of a lot of what's happening with climate change, particularly, up in Glacier National Park. It gets a lot of attention for that fact.
Yes, that's right. So the glaciers in the park are shrinking. The number of named glaciers has declined since the park was established. We've been working on that a bit over the last several summers. I've started a sort of summertime project up there where we go and sample what we call the new lakes. So the lakes have been, some new lakes have formed in the last 50, 75 years as the glaciers have retreated. And they don't even have names or anything like that. They really are barely on the maps. They haven't been sampled before. So we are up there trying to get sort of a baseline of them. It's fun. It's also a lot of work and challenging. But we have some pretty exciting trips up there.
And so what does that, I don't even know, other than sort of just documenting the existence of a new lake, but is there much known scientifically about the attributes of a new lake and
that's
life
the point.
cycles within it? Yeah, talk a little bit about what you've learned through that.
That's the point, because so lakes have food webs. I described that when I was in college before I realized that most people don't appreciate that. They look at a lake, they see a bunch of water.
Yeah.
Maybe they have the sense that if it's green, there's some algae growing in it, but they don't really know that there's food webs, there's animal plankton in there, the things are eating each other, there's all kinds of interactions going on, and the question is, when a new lake forms, you have a lot of questions like about how that ecology gets rolling. How do things get started? Where do they come from? Who gets there first? How does the food web get built over time? Because, if we could come back to those lakes a century from now, they'll have a lot more diversity and a lot more types of organisms than they have currently. And certainly when they just started to form in the first decade or two, there were probably nothing but bacteria and other unicellular microorganisms in there. And there's not much more than that now, even after 50 years, but they seem to be developing an ecology that starts to resemble those that are at lower elevation, but still alpine lakes that we sample.
And so that's one of your kind of current projects. Broadly speaking, Jim, what are kind of the main areas of research questions that you're asking?
Yeah, the biggest things that sort of characterize almost all the work I've done over the years has been trying to understand the role of nutrients and nutrient limitation in shaping ecosystems.
Okay.
And by what do I mean by nutrients? The nutrients I'm talking about are the elemental building blocks of living things. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the key ones, especially that I've studied. These are important for all living things, including us. Our own bodies are composed of those elements along with some others. They're very important for feeding us. So, for example, high yield agriculture, the Green Revolution, is driven in part by the application of chemical fertilizers containing nitrogen and phosphorus. So to feed the world, we really need nitrogen and phosphorus to be applied in agriculture, which of course is a good thing, right? To feed ourselves and make sure everyone's healthy and well fed. But the problem with that comes when those elements are lost from the food system or from ecosystems and our own ecosystems, our urban ecosystems, into rivers and lakes, and then the algae start to grow, because algae like nitrogen, phosphorus too. And so if you see a nice clear lake like Flathead Lake, it's a sign that that lake does not have a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in it. But as those nutrients move around and leak out of places where they're used intensively, it causes algae blooms and water quality degradation and issues. And so a lot of what I've been doing the last 10 years or so is trying to square that circle. How is it that we can continue to feed, 7 billion, 8 billion, maybe 11 billion people eventually in a few decades, without at the same time destroying our drinking water supply by stimulating toxic algae blooms?
I really like the way you frame that, Jim, because so much of it is, a lot of this work connects to advocacy in some important ways, and we can talk about that, but you framed it as a system. A lot of people look at these things as either or, like the science is looking at the consequence of getting these nutrients in the water, and it's sort of held up there as we need to stop doing X, Y, and Z. But you're talking about a balance between a bunch of activities and demands on the resource and how they're balanced with sort of the interests of a society and a community. Can you talk a little bit about is there a holistic perspective in what you do here?
Well, that's kind of, how we're trying to approach things. Myself, speaking just, personally, I've come from a lake perspective, and, I like blue lakes. I like clear lakes.
Sure, we all do.
And we seem all to like those kind of lakes. And I know that you need to get that kind of lake, you got to have, protected from phosphorus inputs. So it's easy for someone from that perspective to say, oh, phosphorus, we got to stop using it. We got to stop applying it. We have, et cetera, et cetera. And then, those farmers, they're destroying everything. It is tempting to go down that road. On the other hand, it's obvious that we need to feed ourselves as well. And it's very hard to figure out the ways, and people are working on this and we're advocating for it. How is it that we can develop, perfect, revolutionize our agricultural systems, our food systems, our water systems, such that we can have abundant food, healthy food that people have access to, while keeping the phosphorus and nitrogen within the food system and keeping it from going places where it doesn't belong. And that's not an easy problem.
Yeah,
it requires a lot of sectors to come together, from what dietary choices people make in their day-to-day life, to how much capital investment takes place on agricultural systems, to whether you incentivize or punish to try to change people's practices with nutrients, whether or not we can develop systems to recover, recycle nutrients from within the food system before they leak out. How do we innovate that? All these things, super complicated, intimidating, exciting to think about. Right now, I'm thinking a lot about them because we're finishing a book, a colleague and I, from Lancaster University, a guy named Phil Haygarth. We're finishing a book about phosphorus that we're writing, for a general audience.
Yeah, you sort of described that to me as a general audience book, The Past and Future of Phosphorus. I don't know if those two concepts are necessarily compatible, general audience and phosphorus, but yeah, make the case for phosphorus. Why should I care about it?
Make the case for it. Well, I think that people are starting to understand carbon.
Yeah, I think barely, but we're trying.
People are starting to come to grips with carbon and what it means, and how we handle it, and how it impinges on our future.
Mm-hmm.
When I talk to people about this, I did this at a informal event up in Whitefish a few weeks ago, at a bar or whatever, talking about science. And I just ask people, hey, how much phosphorus do you have in your body?
Yeah, nobody knows.
And they get this blank look, right? And first you have to explain what phosphorus is. And then you let them know that they have 1.5 pounds of it in their body, and you do, Justin, 1.5 pounds of phosphorus in your body. And then I ask them, well, where is it in your body? And then,
Blank
and then that's
stares.
another puzzled expression. The answer to that question for humans and other vertebrate animals like us is in your bones.
Okay.
90% of it's in your bones in a form of calcium phosphate mineral called apatite. And then the question becomes, where did you get that phosphorus from? Where did it come from? Well, obviously, you got it from your food, but how did your food get it? And then the answer to the question becomes, well, if you're from North America, that phosphorus came from Florida,
right?
Because that's where our phosphorus mines are. But if you're from Europe, that phosphorus probably came from Morocco. And then I can ask them, well, where's your grandchildren's phosphorus going to come from? And that answer probably is that everyone's phosphorus, unless things change a lot, will come from Morocco, because they have 90% of the known phosphorus reserves for producing phosphorus fertilizer. So I don't know. I think that if there's 1.5 pounds of something in your body, you ought to know more about it.
I like that. That's a pretty tight pitch, Jim.
You know?
You've got me won over. Sign me up for a book.
Yeah, good. All right, well, there's one. I'll tell the publisher.
So when I'm thinking about this, the problems that you're looking at, and we mentioned this a little bit earlier, they're big and complicated and systemic, and in many ways, that's the job of science to tackle problems like that. Yet in many sort of areas of science, particularly for junior folks too, like there are rewards to getting more narrow with your areas of inquiry. And so how have you kind of navigated that, or have you navigated that in your career as far as getting work out, getting grants, things like that, this having a giant problem and maybe a paradigm that forces you to, or motivates you to tackle little pieces of it at a time?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not very good at, maybe my boss at the vice president's office for research might like this, but I'm really good at getting proposals rejected by funding agencies. I'm not so good at getting them funded, because I always tend to write the proposal that I'm excited about, but you're supposed to write the proposal that the funding panel is excited about.
Right.
And those two aren't always the same. For me, they tend not to be. So, maybe that's because I've spent a lot of my career not being very specialized, even though it may sound very specialized to talk about something like phosphorus, but I have worked in a lot of different dimensions of it, from limnology, from across ecosystems, from aquatic systems to grasslands to, I published a paper on pandas, giant pandas once. We've worked on cancer biology. We've worked on all kinds of things, and more recently working on this issue of agricultural food system sustainability. Because maybe I have a short attention span or attention deficit disorder or something like that. I think it's more because I like being on learning curves.
Yeah.
I like to learn new things. So I like getting down, into a new literature and trying to figure out how things work. And part of that was for most of my career, I've worked on developing something in it with another unpronounceable word.
A New Angle is brought to you by First Security Bank and Blackfoot, two cool companies doing awesome things all over Montana.
I'm Maureen Dowd of the New York Times, and you're listening to A New Angle.
It's called the theory of ecological stoichiometry.
Yeah, I was really glad. My objective in this whole interview, Jim, is to try to get you to be the first mover on pronouncing that term.
I said it first.
Yeah.
And so stoichiometry is one of the ugliest words in English language. So we've worked on that, and essentially is the study of the elemental recipe of living things.
Okay.
So living things aren't made of arbitrary combinations of elements. They're made of specific elements in specific proportions. And so what we're seeking to understand is, what are the rules that govern those proportions? And given that there are rules for how those elements come together in living tissues or biomass or your body, what does that mean for the organism's ecology, its distribution and nature, its abundance, its dynamics? And so that's been a 30-year quest, sort of developing, and articulating and communicating that theory.
Are
It's been
those
pretty successful, which I think is a sign that the idea is strong because the word is really, really ugly.
yeah.
And so if you can get a concept to catch on with a word that ugly, it must have some power.
I agree. As you're describing this, these proportions, is it discrete in the sense that does everything with this proportion of elements, is everything with this proportion of elements alive, or are there things that have not lived or will not ever live that have this proportion of elements?
Oh yeah, there's no single proportion that you could say that's a living thing.
Okay.
That's a non-living thing just by knowing that proportion. It's more along the lines that the proportions that a living thing can take are quite constrained.
I see.
Yeah.
Gosh.
That is, there's certain chemical proportions. If you've reported them to me, I would say that's not alive. That's not an organism. For
Okay.
example, if you told me you had an organism that had 0 phosphorus in it, I would tell you that that's not a living thing because all living things have phosphorus in them because they need phosphorus to make DNA, for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so when you're thinking about these sorts of questions, are you at the level of microscopic organisms? I mean, I would assume you're talking about things that are really small.
That's mostly what I work on because in lakes and oceans, where I've done most of my work, the organisms we work on are planktonic, bacteria, algae, animal plankton, which are very small, maybe a millimeter or 2. That's a big one.
Yep.
So most of the organisms we worked on are small, but I'm sitting here in my office looking at the ponderosa pine and the other beautiful trees here in the shore of the lake. And we've published a fair amount on the chemical composition of terrestrial ecosystems and organisms like trees and pine needles and leaves and such. And I've been working with, for example, Professor Diana Six at the University of Montana, and she and I published a nice paper recently on bark beetles.
Okay.
And how they relate, how they grow in the bark of a tree, and how they rely on a fungus to transport actually phosphorus from the parts of the tree that are moving the phosphorus around. And so they sort of steal it, and the bark beetle's able to get phosphorus from that source. If it just ate the bark without the fungus, there'd never be enough phosphorus in it for this beetle to grow.
So that's actually, I think, maybe an instructive example, because that sort of science, is super important. Yet it often is the butt of jokes and political debates or something like that. Like there'll be this talking point that such and so got however many $1 million to study the beetles and how they eat bark, and it's such a waste and all that stuff. But maybe talk about how from these little things we can extract really important information about how the broader world operates.
Well, I mean, there's many examples of sort of obscure research that has turned into big payoffs.
Mm-hmm.
I think a good example that's maybe regionally relevant is that the enzyme, there's an enzyme called Taq polymerase, which is used in what's called the polymerase chain reaction, which is the fundamental tool of molecular biology, which is driven a gigantic multi-billion-dollar industry that's revolutionizing healthcare and other domains of endeavor. That enzyme was isolated from a weird microorganisms in a hot spring in Yellowstone National Park.
Interesting.
By someone who was just saying, hey, look at these weird bugs living in this hot spring. I wonder how they do that.
Yeah.
And, they found these enzymes that are resistant to heat. And so you can use them in this special reaction where you heat and cool the sample. And then in the process of doing that, the DNA target is copied and copied and copied for analysis. And so that whole revolutionary process was made possible because someone, was curious about weird microbes that live in hot springs.
Mm-hmm. And so, Jim, I want to talk about a recent honor that you received. You were invited into the National Academy of Sciences, and my understanding is that that's one of the highest, if not the highest, distinction that an American scientist can gain. Can you talk about that achievement and, how, we've talked about the work that sort of drove it, but, first.
It's shocking a little bit. I got my certificate in the mail today.
Oh, really? Nice.
They sent me, if you follow me on Twitter, you can go to Dr. Limnology. That's who I am on Twitter. And I tweeted a picture of it today. So it arrived, my certificate, big certificate that's signed by all the officers of the National Academy. So it's pretty exciting. I think it's the highest honor that a scientist can get that you could reasonably hope for.
Okay.
Because I think a Nobel Prize is probably a bigger deal. Nobel Prizes aren't available for people who work in ecology and environment, though. So, probably for an ecologist, this is the highest thing you can hope for.
Mm-hmm.
It's something you think about sometimes, maybe occasionally once you get to a certain point in your career, but you don't really think it's going to happen.
It's not like you're setting a strategy to earn this distinction, or you're not like.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Some people might.
Yeah, maybe.
From what I can understand about the process, now that I've been elected and I've seen part of the process going on, I don't think anyone understands how it actually happens. It's very complicated, how all the voting takes place and how the nomination takes place. So it'd be very hard to figure out a way to strategize through it. So it's very surprising. It's a huge, honor. I hope that, it can give a platform for the station, for a platform more for, limnology and people who study lakes. There's a number of folks who are in the National Academy who study lakes. So I'm glad to join them there and advocate on behalf of our science and the importance of freshwater ecology for human welfare and well-being. There's only 2 members in the state of Montana now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the second one. So Montana's doubled its representation in the academy. Kathy Whitlock of Montana State is the other member. She's also an ecologist. So it's pretty exciting. There'll be a big ceremony in April of next year where the actual induction takes place in Washington, D.C.
Oh, that's awesome. So you mentioned a little bit of this. I mean, it elevates your field. It elevates Montana. It also elevates the University of Montana and the biostation in particular. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, we talked about that at the beginning of the conversation, but let's go back to the biostation and particularly what's going on at Flathead Lake. I mean, Flathead Lake is such an iconic piece and part of Montana. Talk about the lake and what's happening there and how climate change is affecting the lake and other forces.
The lake is doing great. That's one of the things, I'm happy to go around, there's a lot of people here in this. One of the things that's attractive about this job and coming here is that the community is really engaged.
Yeah.
The people who live here, they love the lake. They're serious about the lake. They're well informed about the lake generally, so when we have events or I'm giving a talk or something, there's always people there. They have great questions. They have a lot of investment, personal, emotional, financial in the lake. Absolutely. And its well-being. And so the lake is doing really well. I've been going around showing these slides for the last year or so, showing that the phosphorus levels in the lake are actually stable and maybe declining over time. In the last several decades, we have good data going back to 1977. That is quite unusual if you compare that to other lakes around North America, and many lakes around the world are going the other direction. Phosphorus levels are going up, algae are going up, algae blooms are going up. So in general, the lake is doing really well. It's just as clear now, maybe even clearer than it was 30 years ago. It's remarkable.
Can you attribute that to just good sort of stewardship of the resource by the communities and so forth?
A lot of things are responsible, part of which is, 65% of the watershed of the lake is in federal protected land, either the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex or other wilderness areas in the catchment or Glacier National Park. So there's much less development and logging and urban development and settlements and such that are taking place because of that. So most of the catchment is protected. The other thing I've been telling people and showing them these data about the nutrient levels is that back in the early 80s, late 70s, the lake was showing some signs of water quality degradation with, maybe some signs of some early algae blooms. And then they decided to invest in wastewater treatment plants in Kalispell and Big Fork and elsewhere. And those treatment plants have been quite effective. They have removed the phosphorus from those possible effluent sites. And as a part of that, the phosphorus levels, as I mentioned, are declining in the lake slowly, or they're stable. So I think it has been wise investment. I think people understand about phosphorus here. Largely, I think, again, credit my predecessors at the biostation did a great job communicating all this stuff. There's a great community here. There's an organization called the Flathead Lakers, which is a lake association founded in 1965, I think. It's been around for quite a while, 1,500 members. And they run a lot of public education events, and that community is very well informed about things that affect the health of the lake. So they don't, not to criticize you, Justin, they don't glaze over when I say phosphorus.
Okay, well, that's good. I mean, yeah.
I'm just saying, so they're tuned into that. The biggest thing we're concerned about now and working on heavily is invasive species prevention.
Right, mussels and all of that.
Yeah, the mussels that have been grabbing the headlines for the past couple of years. As you know, the horrible zebra quagga mussels were found in Tiber Reservoir, possibly in a couple other sites on the east side of the Continental Divide. And that triggered a lot of responses at the state level. And the tribes have also been active. And then we were very active as well in trying to educate folks about the risks involved and to do everything we can to help keep them out. And so we've been developing a cool method called environmental DNA, which is becoming widespread in ecology now, where you don't search for organisms by trying to find the organisms themselves, like in a net or a trap or something.
Okay.
Instead, you take samples and you look for their DNA sequences in your sample. Which is pretty cool.
That seems like a much more sensitive measure, I would think.
It could be. That's right. Because, especially in water, it carries things around, right? So you can think of the water sort of averaging across the whole habitat, if you will. And then if you have the right sampling method and can get that DNA, you can, maybe get an early sign of it. It has its issues, of course, but it's one of the tools that we think can be helpful as we're trying to keep these critters out. This basin, Flathead's at the head of the Columbia River Basin, the only river basin in the United States that's not infested by zebra quagga mussel.
When you're studying the lake, how important, or I guess lakes in general, we focused on phosphorus and other nutrients, but how does temperature of the water play into this? Sure.
Warmer water, a lot of things like warmer water.
Right.
They grow faster. And when you think about algae blooms, the warm water is low density water, it tends to float on top of the lake. And so that keeps the algae up in the sunlight where they can do more photosynthesis. And so it tends to be associated with increased possibility of algal blooms. And so that's one reason we need to keep track of the climate, the weather conditions, the temperature of the air, temperature of the water. We monitor that all pretty regularly. So that's one of the things that's connected. Temperature is also connected to a lot of other things in interesting ways. For example, warmer water holds less oxygen than cold water does. It's a little bit the opposite of what you think, because the more warm the water is, you can dissolve more salt in it, right? But with oxygen, the oxygen is not actually dissolved in the water. It's really mixed into the water.
Okay.
So the warmer the water is, the more oxygen molecules it kicks out back into the atmosphere. So that's important because the warmer the water gets, the less oxygen it holds, and that has implications for things like fish that need a lot of oxygen for metabolism and their own respiration. And so that's one reason we're concerned about temperatures, especially in the rivers around here. As climate change is unfolding, it's going to be reducing the habitat that cold water fish can take advantage of. And those are, the native fish that we, are attached to, like West Slope cutthroat trout and bull trout, are especially cold water adapted. And as things warm up, rainbow trout, which are, not really from around here, and are a little bit ordinary, they start to spread out, take over more of that habitat, hybridize cutthroat trout, and degrade the fishery. And so that's one reason we're concerned about the changing climate around here.
Well, speaking of changing climate and speaking of habitat, I'm looking through my notes here. I see that we talked a little bit about your exploration of newly formed lakes and glacier. You have a story that involves some bear spray during one of those field missions. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, that was pretty crazy. So, but I think it's a sign of what it takes to get the job done. So anyway, we were out, myself and 3 others from the Bierman Station. Our goal was to sample some new lakes that had formed below Blackfoot Glacier. So Blackfoot Jackson glaciers, pair glaciers on the south side of the Going to the Sun Road after you've gone over Logan Pass on the east side there. And so it's a bit of a trip. So you hike in. So basically I do put all our camping gear, backpacking gear together, food, etc., for a couple of days, because we're going to be out for at least 2 days. And then all our sampling gear as well, bottles and nets. And we have a backpacking raft that we carry along.
That's a big kit.
Well, yeah, it's a pretty big kit. So you need a bunch of people to carry all the extra stuff too. So we were going in. We started late one day in the evening, hiked in. You go to Gunsight Lake, and then you head off from there, and then you go off trail, start to get up to the basin, Blackfoot Jackson Basin. And I remember we probably started too late that day, and I was pretty tired. These are young guys I'm hiking with, and so I'm not as good at keeping up with them. Eventually, you're up on the slope, trying to get up on the basin, and it was about 10:30 at night or 11 hours spent. So I said, okay, we're done. So we just sort of laid down, found some semi-flat spots, ate some food, and slept. And again, up early the next morning, fine, okay. Start moving, 5, 6 in the morning or something. Start climbing up to the basin itself, about an hour and a half, up there. And God, it's beautiful. We come over this ridge. Lakes are down below us. There's the glacier in front of us. Gorgeous sunrise. It's fantastic. Here we are with our packs. We're heading down to the lake, and I step on a rock, but it was a round rock, and it so rolled out from under me. Ooh. And I went completely airborne with my full pack on, slammed into the ground, pretty hard. Sort of staggered to my feet, and as I'm sort of staggering to my feet, I start to choke, coughing, terrible, and a terrible smell is in my nose, and I'm like, what is going on? This is horrible.
Gosh. Yep.
And within a short period of time, maybe 20 seconds of this flailing around, one of my companions come running up, get your bear spray, get rid of it. And he runs up and grabs the bear spray, which is on my hip belt, and throws it away. And so when I fell, I broke the lid off it.
Sure, punctured it in some way?
It wasn't punctured. The whole lid had come off.
Oh, gosh.
And the can was sitting on my hip belt and just spraying me from close range. And it was quite remarkable. So we staggered out of the cloud and sat down, and then it took me about a half an hour to recover from that. It was a pretty weird and strange experience, because during the incident, I had a couple of thoughts that formed in my head. One was I formed the hypothesis that what was going on is that when I fell, I had breathed in very hard, like that, and had breathed in a leaf from a plant.
Okay.
And it was making the smell and was clogging my airway. That's what I thought was going on.
That's what it felt like, a leaf.
And then the next thing I thought was that, wow, the next thing I thought was, what kind of brain injury can you sustain when you start smelling things? That was the second thought I had.
Well, it would be probably difficult to conduct studies on both of those questions, right? Particularly the second one.
Yeah, luckily both of them were wrong, and someone else was thinking more clearly at the moment, and it took about a half an hour, and I was able to keep moving, and then we got the sampling done. But that day lasted about 17 hours. I think we were on trail for about 12 hours by the time we got the sampling done and got it back out to the truck. It was almost dark.
I mean, I think that probably cuts both ways. It's wonderful to be. I mean, I'm sure you have moments where you're like, wow, I get to work here. Like, this is my office.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, that's an office that takes a lot of work to get to. It's a challenging commute. I'd rather have that commute than many others, but it's challenging nonetheless.
Yeah, I've had a lot of great adventures in my career. That was one of them. A lot of the other sampling events don't go like that, right? They're much more smooth than that, but I've had a lot of wild adventures, and mostly fun, nothing dangerous, or no one's ever been injured in any of those. So we've always come through in the end. So it's quite the thing.
Well, Jim, it's been super fun learning about your work. Congratulations again on this National Academy of Sciences recognition. It's fantastic that this is happening here at the University of Montana. I hope that your next session of adventure limnology doesn't involve bear spray, or at the very least, you're spraying it at something else. So
that's right. Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate the chance to come on here. I just want to invite anyone who's out there listening to come by the biostation. We have various public events during the year. In summer, we have an open house, for example. We have a Science on Tap event every month in the Big Fork. And if there's any students out there, or people who know students, have a look at our website and learn about our summer session, where you can take a class and get in on all this excitement.
Absolutely. Great resource, and I encourage everybody to take advantage. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, hope you enjoyed that one as much as I did. Get yourself up to the Flathead Lake Biostation and check it out. It's an incredible resource. All right, coming up next week, we have legendary Montana artist Monty Dolak. Super stoked for that one, so stay tuned next week. Thanks for listening to A New Angle. We really appreciate it. And we're coming to you from Studio 49, a gift from University of Montana alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. And remember that A New Angle is supported by CED, Consolidated Electrical Distributors. These guys pretty much sell anything electrical you would ever need, but they also hire a ton of our students. If you want to learn more about jobs at CED, visit cedcareers.com. Before we go, I want to thank some important peeps: executive producer Stefan Borsum, and interns Aspen Runkle and Max Gibson. Huge thanks to VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks for the tunes. And finally, props to Jeff Meese, our master of all things sound. Finally, if you have any questions, suggestions, comments, insults, whatever, please email me at anewangle@umontana.edu. Help us spread the word, and be sure to use the hashtag #anewangle when you do. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.